Hello, everybody. I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. Rita Rudner. I don't know who knows who she is and who doesn't know who she is, and I don't know who's actually watching these videos, so it's anybody's guess. Rita Rudner is best known as a stand-up comedian, and her part of her shtick is that she shows up in these enormous, spangly, sparkly, pretty, what have you ball gowns. It's actually kind of, I suspect, part of the reason why this particular cover photo is of her in this dress with the velvety, sleeveless top thing and what is probably a fairly voluminous skirt beneath. Um, So Rita Rudner is not, she's not a shock sort of stand-up comedian. Um, a lot of her jokes, she does not so much observational humor, although there's a certain amount of it. She tends to do a lot of storytelling, a lot of personal storytelling. Um, and there's a certain amount of exaggeration for comedic effect and a certain amount of lengthy pauses for building suspense. You kind of have to see her perform live. So if you're curious, you can probably find her somewhere on YouTube because it's YouTube and most things are findable on it. This particular book is just a collection of essays. They're practically, in a lot of ways, you could consider them to be her stand up routines just put down on paper. Um, so, uh, these are funny stories. These are her ongoing complaint about the fact that her husband doesn't like the way she drives and is constantly losing his mind whenever she's behind the wheel and he's a passenger in her car, even though he's the one with two moving violations because he doesn't know that you're supposed to stop at a stop sign. Apparently stop signs in the UK, at least at the time that this book was published, at the time that this book was written and published, which is the early 90s, at least at that time in the UK, based on what her husband claims, stop signs were more a matter of a rolling stop or perhaps that you only had to stop at them if there were other people there. I wouldn't know because, of course, I've never driven in the UK, and I wouldn't want to because I find it hard enough to drive on roads when I know which way is the right one to go. Um, in any event, her husband had a moving violation for not stopping at a stop sign, and one for making a U-turn where there was a double yellow line because apparently double yellow lines either are not used in the UK or mean something else. But he didn't understand that you're not allowed to do a U-turn just because you want to. Um, so the thing is that this is to get an idea. I'll read you her acknowledgments. I was going to thank some people, but I was afraid I would leave someone out. Then I thought, I'll thank everyone, but I was afraid I would thank some people who didn't deserve to be thanked. So I decided not to thank anyone because the people who I was going to thank know who they are. Thank you. Um, and that's very much her style of humor. She's very much about pauses, very much um, about allowing you to fill in the blanks. Um, and she's very, very conversational. Uh, this is somewhat different than Dave Barry, who tends to be a little sharper than she is. But Dave Barry also, I suspect, is something of a better writer. She's not a bad writer. She's a perfectly good comedian. She thinks very hard about what she's saying and how she's saying it. But I don't think that this would ever win a Pulitzer Prize. Um, just to give you a little further idea, this is the back cover. Um, this is, I think, less in her wheelhouse of humor, actually, this photograph. This is the kind of photograph that professional photographers make book authors do because they want to show how funny and wacky the book author is. Um, somewhat more in her, somewhat more in the wheelhouse of her humor is the collection of cartoons in this book, because there are cartoons in it which are credited to a Mike Lester. And, this woman leaning over a psychic and asking the psychic to just tell me where I parked my car. That's much closer to the kind of humor that she has. The humor of somebody trying to find their car in New York after they've forgotten where they parked it, or better yet, in a mall parking lot. She talks a lot about female sorts of things like shopping and how much she loves to score a great sale. Whether or not she likes the clothes, the important thing is the important thing is the sale. She also talks about why she doesn't want to have children, why she doesn't think that she's properly cut out to have children, in which she talks about that her friend, who she says, let's call her Jeremiah, because I don't know anyone called that and I don't want any of my friends to be mad at me, immediately bought one of those books that have pictures of what the baby is doing every day. I'm not sure it's entirely accurate. In one photo, the baby is playing cards. She looks at me strangely because I have imagined the photo of the baby playing cards because I was so bored. Another friend, for variety's sake, I'll call this friend Phlegh, which is spelled Phleghh. And in the course of this, she talks about this friend who wanted a natural birth and had an apparently very exciting natural birth. She talks a lot about her parents, about the kind of influence her parents had on her, the influence her parents had on her while she was growing up, and how that has given her a perspective as an adult. She also talks about what frankly sounds like an incredibly aggravating boyfriend who he asked her, why don't you cook for me? To which she said, I actually like you. And he didn't understand the joke there, which I think she's right in that when he didn't understand the joke that she was making there, she probably should have broken up with him then, but instead she went along with it and cooked for him, and he seemed to just assume that she would start cooking for him. This is something that many women suffer from, is the man who assumes that this is just fundamental to women, is being in the kitchen. She also has, and I give you the last picture that I bothered to scan for this particular video, some vacation photos. The thing is, this tree's in front of the Notre Dame. Those of us who remember having film cameras, who remember the days before digital photography, will always remember some of these pictures. These pictures that you took with your film camera, that you couldn't take them back, you couldn't erase them. You thought you took a good picture, and it was instead blurry and half obscured by trees. Or your thumb, or is mostly dark because you were either in a dark place or hadn't figured out how to make the flash work. This book being written in the 90s was from the days when people still had film cameras, and it's something that those who grew up with digital cameras, or who have not had a film camera for so long that they've forgotten it, may not be able to empathize with so well, which is the vacation pictures that you take that you thought, well, these are my vacation photos. I'm not going to see them until I develop them later. I'm just going to hope they turned out okay. It's something that the at least somewhat older among us, perhaps not genuinely elderly, but the starting to slowly creep into middle-aged might okay, I'm too young to be claiming that I'm middle-aged, but I'm young enough to remember when 30 was old, to, quote Dina Carter. Um, so I'm I'm calling myself creeping into old anyways. Because 30 is 35 actually, is so elderly. The thing is that you if you're old enough to remember it, you remember these photos, the photos that you wind up keeping because it is your only photo of Notre Dame. Unless you're like me and you say, I bought postcards, and a professional photographer took those. Um, it's part of the reason I never take a lot of pictures is because I figure if I want a picture of something, I'll buy a postcard that a professional photographer took, and then I don't have to, have one of these sitting on a hard drive somewhere or in a photo album. In any event, um, it's a funny book. It's funny and lighthearted, and it's definitely it's a book that is sharply female in perspective. Um, perhaps it has some holes in it due to when it was written and the age Rita Rudner was at the time that she wrote it, and so on and so forth. It is more a book of its moment than some other things, but at the same time, um, it is in a lot of ways distinctly timeless. Her memories of how little she actually got out of school, which she freely admits was partly because she wasn't paying attention. But nonetheless, I didn't get anything out of this teacher that I can recall. The the weird things that her parents did that have affected her long term, uh, the various experiences in her life, these are, while the specifics of it are not are not going to be universal. I think she has a lot of experiences that are not going to be universal in the specifics. The generalities of experience of your parents doing weird stuff that you find yourself doing years later, even though you thought it was silly then and you think it's silly now, but you still do it because it's how you were raised to see the world. Um, these things, these things are all very, very much in this book and part of this book. And um, I think, as with the best comedians, there's a clarity of vision that comes from looking at the world from that slightly outside perspective. Her story about taxes, she has a story about taxes, for example, and in that story, she talks about how she didn't understand taxes because she left home when she was 16 to become a professional dancer. And she didn't understand taxes. She didn't know how they worked. Somebody just told her, put all of your receipts in a shoebox and bring them to an accountant. And nobody told her more than that. She was just expected to understand how it worked. Um, and her whole story there speaks to the experiences that you have when you first leave home, when you first step out into the world, because nobody tells you these things. There's a lot of things in the world that nobody tells you that you find out later, and when you tell them to people, they look at you and say, well, yes, didn't you know that? Um, there's a lot of that in the world, and she captures a lot of that in this book. And so it's fun, it's light, and it's really, really great for carrying around with you as a read, for when you're waiting in line, because it's a bunch of short essays, so it's good for that. And I don't think I really have anything left to say, so my time's up, and I will see you all next week.